Air pollution, climate change, global warming, issues that dominate the news. What can any of us do to make a difference? There is something you can do, and it's at your local Saturn retailer. EV-1, the electric car from General Motors.
Welcome to Tech Tales. I'm Corbin, here with my friend Joe.
Hello.
Hello, Joe. Today we're going to be talking about the General Motors EV-1, which was one of the first mainstream electric cars. Have you heard of this car, Joe?
I have not, but I'm feeling very stereotyped right now because I think you brought in your one friend from Michigan to talk about GM.
Feeling something personal, are we?
I don't actually know hardly anything about cars despite living here, so I'm interested to learn.
So you're a fake Michigan.
Yeah.
I see. Okay. Well, hopefully you'll learn something today, or you'll forget about it in a couple days, and then you can just listen to this whenever you need to learn again.
Perfect.
Yeah. This might surprise you, but prior to about the 1960s, there wasn't many laws regarding air quality in the United States. It was very much just you can put whatever you want in the air.
Right.
And that was causing a lot of problems. So starting in the 1960s, the United States federal government and a couple of states started passing laws to improve air quality. The main one here was the Clean Air Act, which was passed in 1963, and it allowed the federal government to control air pollution for the first time. That Clean Air Act was amended several times throughout the 60s, 70s, and 90s, and each of those amendments targeted air pollution from both like large industrial plants as well as motor vehicles. However, some states, such as California, started creating their own guidelines that were stricter than what the federal government was doing.
That does sound like California.
Yeah, very California thing to do. So with that backdrop, in January 1990, General Motors showed off its concept electric car called the Impact at the 1990 LA Auto Show. And I've got a video for you to watch of someone driving the car.
Well, it definitely looks like it's from the 90s. The design is like super rounded, I guess you could say. And the video was not super flattering either. It was kind of a boring video. But it really doesn't look that crazy for an electric vehicle in the 90s. The like console and all that jazz looks pretty standard.
Yeah, it does have that 90s car aesthetic.
I would say the weirdest part of it is the back.
There's not really a trunk. I can't tell.
Yeah, I don't think there is a trunk. And like the rear tires are halfway covered.
I don't know if you noticed, there's no like gear shift. I think there are just buttons on the console for that.
Oh yeah.
There's no like stick.
That is weird.
Oh, they're next to the key slot. The starter. I don't know what car components are called. So yeah, just, 90s car, but a little bit more rounded, I guess. So anyway, so this is the car that GM shows off in 1990. It's a two-seater designed from the ground up as an electric vehicle. So unlike a couple other attempts at EVs before this and many cars after this that were EVs, it wasn't just the skeleton of a gas car that they put batteries in and called it a day. It was powered by 32 lead acid batteries, which are the same type of battery that go in gas cars, like that, powers all the electric components and just gets recharged by the gas.
Yeah.
So a little bit weird there. General Motors said this concept car could go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 8 seconds. Now, if you're like me, you have no idea what a good time for that is. So I looked up some comparisons. The 2020 Tesla Model 3 Plus goes 0 to 60 in 5 seconds. The 2020 Nissan Leaf S goes 0 to 60 in 8.4. And the 2021 Chevy Bolt goes 0 to 60 in 6.5 seconds.
So not awful.
Yeah, that's pretty good for, 1990 electric cars, rather. The concept car had a range of 124 miles, and the battery pack would need to be replaced every 20,000 miles, which would cost around $1,500. So that was a little rough.
124 miles, you said?
Yeah.
Okay, so what does a standard Tesla get?
I think they're around 200, 250 now.
Okay.
Yeah, so this would have just basically been like a commuter car, like, a lot of people use EVs for now.
Yeah.
But, this was a concept car, and General Motors said at the time that it wasn't sure if they could market it, like if anyone really wanted this car. However, in September of 1990, the California Air Resources Board adopted a new program called the Low Emission Vehicle and Clean Fuels Program. And this had been in development as early as 1988, but General Motors showing off this impact car and giving a test drive to some members of the Air Resources Board helped California officials see that low emission vehicles could be practical. So they had been wanting to do something like this for a while, but they weren't sure if car manufacturers could actually make electric vehicles. And, once they saw this, they're like, oh yeah, okay, they can probably do this.
Yeah.
So the program required that auto companies selling cars in California would have to produce a certain number of low emission vehicles. The original guidelines were that low emission vehicles had to make up 2% of car fleets starting in 1998 for each company, raising to 5% in 2001 and then 10% in 2003. So a little bit of a sliding scale there to try to ramp up the technology. And the rule applied to any company selling 35,000 cars or more in California every year. So at the time, that included Chrysler, Ford, General Motors, Honda, Mazda, Nissan, and Toyota. Also, when California announced this, New York and Massachusetts pledged to follow California's lead, and they were going to adopt the same rules. So that sort of created an incentive for General Motors to sell the car, because now California needed 2% of their cars to be electric in a couple years.
Oh, so you mean California wanted 2% of all the cars in their state to be electric?
All the cars sold in a certain year.
Okay.
So in the year of 1998, General Motors, all the cars they sell in California, 2% of those would have to be electric, basically.
Got it.
And then that would ramp up to 5% of sales in 2001. Now that California was doing this, General Motors started to test the Impact concept car with potential customers across the country. 50 cars were given to households on a 2-week loan, and volunteers had to submit requests to test out the car through their electric utilities, because those companies would come in and install the fancy charger in their garages. General Motors expected around 4,000 people to apply in Los Angeles, but they got 9,300 responses. And they expected fewer than 5,000 people to be interested in the New York area, but they got 14,000 responses.
Wow.
Yeah. So almost immediately, there's this interest in the car that maybe they weren't expecting. There wasn't a lot of coverage about the concept car test because it was so limited, but generally drivers really liked the car.
How are they getting the news out about this at this time? Like, to get people to even want to, like, was this just news coverage and stuff like that was spreading the word?
Yeah. Well, they were doing it through the electric companies. So I believe the electric companies would reach out and say, hey, do you want to do this? But after the loan period, GM took the cars back and destroyed them.
What?
Yeah. I think this is a thing that car companies do with like concept vehicles because they don't want someone driving them out of the junkyard. or whatever and driving them on the road.
Okay, I guess I can see that.
It's kind of funny, though. In 1995, California actually changed its timeline for the electric vehicle requirements. So the original rule said that 2% of all cars produced by 1998 had to be electric cars. However, they were now changing it so that 10% of car fleets would have to be electric, but they were moving up the date to 2003. And the new rules said that only around 3,750 cars produced between 1998 and 2000 would have to be electric, whereas the original rules had that around 60,000. So they were ramping this down significantly.
Yeah.
Sort of pushing it off like, okay, just when you're ready, make some electric cars. The rule change had a mixed response. Environmental advocates were upset that California was starting to push this off. Car manufacturers and some others in the industry thought that the battery technology wasn't ready yet. Like I said earlier, that the impact car would need its $1,500 battery packs replaced every 20,000 miles.
Yeah. Honestly, though, that doesn't sound that awful to me when you said it, but
I mean, especially when you think about like the car doesn't really need any other maintenance. Like you don't need oil changes. You don't need, there's not going to be random bits in the engine that fall apart.
Yeah.
I think it's still a little bit of a harder sell.
I mean, it's almost like replacing a part of your, or like upgrading a part of your computer instead of getting a new computer. Like keep the car, upgrade the batteries.
I don't know. Maybe the battery argument was a little bit of a harder sell than like general car maintenance. With gas cars, like you don't really know how often something needs to be repaired until it needs to be fixed.
Mm-hmm.
But here, like, when you were buying an electric car, GM was like, okay, you will 100% have to spend this money every 20,000 miles. So I don't know. Maybe that wasn't as compelling.
And we know that people love to change.
Right. Also, that same year, General Motors announced that it would begin commercial production of an electric car, and they said it would be based on that impact concept. And they eventually revealed that the name would be the General Motors EV-1, which I didn't know this, but apparently that was the first car in the company's history to use the GM brand instead of one of its subdivisions.
Interesting. Do they do that today even?
I don't think so.
I think so
most of their cars get sold under like Chevy.
Right.
But
they have GMC, which is kind of GM.
Finally, in December 1996, the General Motors EV-1 becomes available. The initial launch was only at select Saturn dealerships across California and Arizona. Right, this is when we had Saturn cars.
Yeah.
The MSRP was $34,000, but GM wasn't actually letting anyone buy it. You could only lease the car. Besides the $500 per month, GM also required that charging stations be installed at each buyer's home, which costs about $1,000 for the initial installation. And the design for the EV-1 looked almost identical to that impact car. I did see in some of the reports that the EV-1 took 9 seconds to go from 0 to 60 instead of 8 seconds for the concept car. So there were like a couple changes somewhere, but it was pretty close to the car, which doesn't happen all that much. Usually whenever car companies show off like crazy concepts at car shows, the final version isn't nearly as cool.
Right.
I'm going to have you read this review from Autocar, or this section of the review from Autocar.
There's no question that the EV-1 is a technological triumph for GM, but at the same time, it's an essentially flawed endeavor. The sad fact is that the car is lugging around a whopping 522 kilograms of lead-acid batteries to go at best 90 miles. A car powered by an efficient conventional engine carrying the same weight in petrol could travel 10,000 miles. The EV-1 is also hopelessly handicapped by the hideous expense of the batteries. A great deal of electric cars' future depends on factors beyond manufacturers' control. Government subsidies, tax credits, and other financial support for owners could make a significant difference In the meantime, GM deserves praise for creating a milestone in the evolution of the electric car.
So right there, you can tell the EV-1 has the same issue that a lot of later cars had, where the manufacturer says it can go 120 miles. When you have to deal with hills and accelerating and decelerating all the time, the range is usually shorter.
Yeah, 90 miles is not a lot.
There was one more review I found from Car and Driver.
Other electric car makers are going with onboard conductive recharging systems, so there's a VHS versus beta situation brewing. We can't predict how it will pan out, but we can observe that the EV-1 has limited appeal right now. It is quiet, it performs well, and it emits no pollution, but the range problems, the recharging time, and the high purchase cost are obstacles that will have to be overlooked or overcome before the EV-1 presents a viable alternative to gas-powered cars. Still, it's a start.
Generally, the opinion is this car isn't amazing, but it's the first step.
It's pretty much exactly what I would have expected the reviews for one of the early electric cars to be.
Yeah. By May of 1997, General Motors had only leased 176 of these cars. And by the end of 1997, that was 300. So not very many of these.
No.
Because again, you could only lease them, and they were only at a handful of dealerships. And the dealerships were located around where the charging systems were set up. But also, General Motors seemed not super interested in widespread marketing for the EV-1. Most of the advertising was through direct mail and some magazines. There weren't very many TV ads or radio ads or anything like that. One General Motors employee told the New York Times a few years later, they said, "We launched the car in December of 1996, and by about April, I'd figured we'd been duped. They weren't marketing the vehicle."
They probably didn't want to have to make many.
Yeah. So some people who were buying the car thought that General Motors actually just wanted the car to fail so that it could, they could go to California and say, "Look, no one wants this car. Don't make us do this requirement. We don't want to do it." And no one wants the car. But because some of these people thought that the failure point was just that people didn't know about it, some actually basically took it upon themselves to sell the car for GM.
Are you talking about fanboys, Corbin?
Yeah, basically. So this is the most interesting part of this entire story for me. This guy named Marvin V. Rush, who at the time was working as a cinematographer for Star Trek Voyager, which was on TV at the time, spent $20,000 of his own money to produce and air 4 unauthorized radio commercials for the EV-1. And because he was working on Star Trek Voyager, he got some Voyager stars to voice the commercials for him.
Oh my.
So are you familiar with Robert Picardo at all?
No.
Okay. He was the holographic doctor on Star Trek Voyager. And he was in about half of these commercials. It took a while for me to find these, the audio recordings, because I found a couple news articles that were saying oh, this guy made these radio commercials, and I'm like, okay, but where are they? Where can I listen to them? And I finally found out there was a EV-1 fan site that's still online, and it had the recordings. So I cleaned up one of the audio files.
I'm impressed that these are even available online at all.
Wouldn't it be great if every morning when you got up, your car had a full tank? While you were sleeping, it just filled itself up. And wouldn't it be great if your car was really quick? The kind of quick that could leave ordinary cars behind. Service would come with the car, and it wouldn't need much service either. Maybe twice a year they'd rotate the tires and wash it for you. Everything would be covered, from tires to wiper blades. This car would be great for the environment. It wouldn't even have a tailpipe. And when you pulled into a store with this car, the shop owner would be so glad to see you, he would fill up your tank for free. So original that every time you stop, a crowd formed just to see it. So inexpensive to operate that you could forget about the cost of fuel. Where do you get a car like that? EV-1, the electric car from General Motors. Available now at your local Saturn retailer. Call 1-800-25-ELECTRIC for information.
That's not a bad ad, I gotta say.
No, it's not.
I wouldn't have known who that was, but he convinced me to buy one.
So there were a couple more of these with other Voyager cast members, but General Motors was actually opposed to the commercials initially, but they later made them official and actually reimbursed Rush for making them.
Oh,
so
really?
So GM
Wow.
eventually aired these. Yeah.
It's weird though, because it almost looks bad if you're like vehemently against it, because it's like he's just trying to sell more of your product.
Yeah.
If you tell him to stop, it's like, okay, I guess you really don't want to sell any of this product.
Yeah. So a little bit after this, General Motors releases the second generation of the EV-1 for the 1999 model year. And there are actually two versions of this car. So one of them is an EV-1 with upgraded lead acid batteries, which, were the same technology that the first gen was using. And that had a range of around 80 to 100 miles. But they also had an EV-1 with nickel metal hydrate batteries, and that had a range of 100 to 140 miles. So definitely an improvement there.
Yeah.
And also GM cut the cost of installing a home charger to $500. It was previously $1,000.
So at this time, was home the only place that you could charge these things?
So there were around 300 public charging stations in Southern California and the San Francisco Bay Area. And in Arizona, there were around 43. So it's a lot like today, where if you have an electric car, you're probably going to charge it at your home just overnight. But if you are out and about, there are some charging stations for you.
That's more than I would have expected it, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. It helped because there were a couple other companies that were trying to make electric cars at this time. I believe like one of the more successful ones was Toyota. So they were all trying to deploy some kind of charging infrastructure for these cars. However, General Motors ended up only building 500 of the Gen 2 cars, which were just barely enough to meet California's requirements. So then in January of 2001, California changed its EV rules again. So now only 2% of cars sold in 2003 would have to be electric cars, with another 8% as extremely low emission cars. But that was a big drop from 10% by 2003.
Yeah.
And which itself was again another big drop from the previous rules. But even with these lower requirements, General Motors still said the plan was impractical, and they asked the California Air Resources Board to reconsider again.
I love how California is bending to, meet the minimum requirements here for GM, and GM is still just like,
yeah.
Could you be a little nicer?
I don't know if I feel like it, California. So a month later, in February of 2001, General Motors filed a lawsuit against California for the EV requirements.
Oh boy.
They said that battery-powered cars like the EV-1 would be impractical at mass scale. And they also said that to meet the current requirement, General Motors would have to produce thousands of small golf cart-like EVs. I guess under the assumption that they couldn't sell the EV-1, even though the demand for it was outstripping the product. In February of 2002, General Motors informed EV-1 drivers that their current leases would not be renewed. So they were effectively discontinuing the car. Some of the people who had the cars actually sent checks to GM to try to buy the car outright. But
wow.
GM refused because they said that under U.S. law, and presumably California had some rules with this too, if they sold the car to people, then they would also have to continue manufacturing parts for a very long time. I think it's 15 years or something like that.
Right, and the whole battery replacement issue.
Right. So most of the leases expired in 2003, but a few people that got leases like right before GM said no, they could keep driving their EV1s until August of 2004. So that's when the car was completely pulled off the roads. So just like the Impact concept car, General Motors ended up crushing most EV1s that were returned back to them.
Now, you said most. Are you going to tell me that there are some of these still out there?
I did say most. Good observation. General Motors did keep a few intact EV1s, and the bulk of those were sent to universities for, like, their science programs or whatever to look at it and tear it apart if they wanted. I don't think GM really cared. The cars they sent out were deactivated, so you couldn't actually drive them. So they pulled out like the drivetrain and I guess the batteries too. But one model, which was donated to the Western Washington University, was actually repaired by students and faculty in 2007. GM later asked that the repaired car should not be driven on public road. There was something in the agreement when they sent the cars to those universities. I was like, hey, please don't drive this. But the school later turned it into a hybrid car, which GM was fine with for some reason. I'm not really sure what the deal was there, but so that car still exists as far as I know as a hybrid.
Weird.
Also in December 2015, there was an episode aired of Jay Leno's Garage. I didn't think researching this podcast would involve signing up for Peacock so I could watch Jay Leno's Garage. But
that's dedication.
But that's how it ended up. That's on the free category. You can watch without paying money. In that episode of Jay Leno's Garage, he goes and looks at some cars owned by Francis Ford Coppola, which is the director of The Godfather. And he shows off his cars, and he actually has an EV-1. And he said in the episode that he liked the car, and then when he found out that GM was taking them back, he hid it.
What?
Yeah, I don't know. What killed me is, like, I saw a snippet of this on YouTube or something. So I was like, okay, I got to see the whole episode because surely they've got to, like, spend more time on this. No, it's like 20 seconds in this 40-minute long episode. It's just him saying, oh, yeah, I have this car. I heard they were taking it back, so I hid it. And now I have it. There's
all these EV-1 fanboys who are like, please,
yeah,
GM, I'm sending you a check. Let me keep the car. And they never thought to just hide it.
Yeah. Yeah. And this director is just like, no. And I guess GM was like, okay. Like, I'd love to know more about that story. Also, I'd love to know if that car works. Because again, like, that's the other thing with all the other cars that still exist is that they had them gutted before GM sent them away. So, like, does that car work? I have no idea. They did not say.
I'd have to imagine the batteries would be long gone by now.
Yeah, they'd have to replace the batteries.
I'm sure that's what Francis Ford Coppola spends his time doing.
Yeah. He's scouring eBay for the exact compatible battery.
He's on those EV-1 fan forums you found.
Yeah. So a lot of the other EV-1s that were given to universities, a lot of them were just abandoned or they were parked in the parking lots owned by the schools and just kind of left there. It's like they didn't really have anything to do with them.
Here's your gift. Bye.
However, I did find an article from January of 2021 where at least one of the cars that were given to a university was still in, like, perfect condition. I think that one was also deactivated, but, like, they showed off some pictures of it and it looked like it did when it was new.
It does look pretty dang pristine. Did you see this other article on thedrive.com about finding one in an Atlanta parking garage?
That was one of a couple ones I found where the cars are just sort of left out in the open. Red EV-1 just in a parking garage, and It's all dusty because no one's driven it in years.
Why didn't they give any of these to, like, a museum or something?
Well, there is one in the Smithsonian, and I don't know if that one is deactivated. There was one donated to the Smithsonian. I'm not sure which museum exactly it's in right now, but they do have one. That's really it. That's the story of the EV-1, one of the first. I don't want to say mass production because I don't know if
it definitely was not mass produced.
I don't know if
3,000
cars counts as mass production.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the rarest cars in the world. That's what this article says.
This one was interesting to research because there's two narratives with everything written about this car. There's the opinion of the people who really like the car, who say that this was a great car and GM just wanted it to fail, so they didn't have to produce electric cars. And then there's the other narrative from GM and some people working in the car industry who were basically we don't really know if we can sell this, and a lot of the technology we need isn't there yet.
Yeah.
And I think that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle there, because a car with a range of, let's say, around 100 miles, that is a hard sell. It's still a hard sell today.
For sure. But it's not if you had asked me before you told me any of this to, come up with what the reviews were of the car at the time, it would have been very similar to the reviews that I read. So
yeah,
it's really that's what you would expect from a electric car at that time. That part's not really surprising to me. The interesting part is, to me at least, was GM actually trying with this?
I think the engineers in GM were trying, but the rest of the company was not. I think that's what happened here. GM's argument time and time again was the technology is not there yet. But the technology wasn't there yet because there wasn't a production car being, sold in vast quantities that needed good battery technology and all these other components you need for an EV. The demand for the car would push that underlying technology forward.
Yeah, it's the whole Tesla situation, It's they came along and kind of pushed that to what it is now.
Yeah. Well, it's this has happened so many times, the space race in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
The 60s were a huge push in technology just because all of America wanted to get to the moon.
Yeah.
I would have liked to see GM stick with it.
It's car companies, though, man. They are so hesitant to change. GM was probably doing pretty fine in the 90s with gas vehicles. So, what was their incentive to rock the boat?